The Mafia boss had trusted thousands of people over the years, but only one person had never betrayed his confidence: the quiet, plus-size Maid, who had served his estate without asking for recognition. So when she failed to appear before sunrise for the first time in 3 years, he abandoned an emergency meeting that involved millions of dollars and followed the only clue she had unknowingly left behind. Minutes later, he found her kneeling alone before her late mother's shattered gravestone, her hands covered in black paint and blood as she desperately tried to erase a sentence that mocked both her and the woman she loved most. She never cried for herself. She only whispered another apology to someone who could no longer hear it. The Mafia boss silently removed his coat, wrapped it around her trembling shoulders, reached for his phone, and before dawn broke over the city, an order spread across the underworld that guaranteed one family's entire empire would never recover. The first thing the household noticed that morning was not the silence. It was the breakfast table. For 3 years, everything inside the estate had moved with effortless precision. Fresh flowers always appeared before dawn. The silverware gleamed. The coffee was ready before anyone asked. Every hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and lilies, and every member of the staff assumed those details simply happened. No one ever thought about the woman responsible. She arrived before sunrise. She finished long after everyone else had gone to bed. She never complained. She never asked for recognition. She simply worked. That morning, however, the dining room remained unfinished. One vase still held wilted flowers from the previous day. Dust lingered on the grand staircase, and the head chef found himself waiting for ingredients that had somehow never reached the kitchen. The older servants exchanged puzzled glances. "Has anyone seen her?" One maid shook her head. "I thought she was helping in the laundry." Another frowned. "She wasn't in her room." The housekeeper checked her watch. "She's never been late." Not once. Not in 3 years. Upstairs, inside the estate's private conference room, several advisors waited around a polished oak table. Financial reports covered the surface. Maps of shipping routes glowed across a large screen. A billion-dollar negotiation with 3 international partners was scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes. Normally, nothing interrupted meetings like these. Not politics, not rival families, not even police investigations. Yet the Mafia boss barely looked at the documents. His attention drifted toward the window overlooking the courtyard below. Every morning, almost without realizing it, he had grown accustomed to seeing the plus-size Maid crossing the garden with a basket of fresh linens balanced carefully in her arms. She was never hurried, never careless. She greeted every gardener, every cook, every security guard with the same gentle smile before disappearing into another part of the estate. This morning, the courtyard was empty. One advisor cleared his throat. "The investors have already arrived." No response. Another tried again. "We should begin." Instead of answering, the Mafia boss asked a question that surprised everyone in the room. "Where is she?" The advisors looked at one another in confusion. "The maid." He nodded once. The housekeeper, who had just entered with updated schedules, hesitated before answering. "We've searched the estate." "And no one has seen her since yesterday evening." The room fell quiet. His advisors expected him to dismiss the matter immediately. After all, one maid disappearing for a few hours could hardly compare to the meeting waiting downstairs. But he did not move. His gaze settled on the empty courtyard once more. 3 years. She had worked through heavy snowstorms. She had continued working after suffering a high fever. She had even returned to the estate the morning after burying her own mother. She never missed work. Not once. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Without another word, he stood. One advisor blinked in disbelief. "The meeting. Reschedule it." The sentence landed like a stone. Another advisor stared at him. "Those investors flew across 3 countries to meet you. They can fly again." The room froze. No one argued. Everyone understood the meaning hidden behind his calm voice. The meeting no longer mattered. He buttoned his coat and walked toward the exit. His chief of security hurried after him. Should I prepare the convoy? No. Bodyguards? Only one vehicle. The guard hesitated. It may not be safe. The Mafia boss stopped walking just long enough to answer. If something has happened to her, someone else should be worried about safety. The hallway fell silent. No one dared ask another question. The estate's security office came alive within minutes. Surveillance footage from every entrance appeared across dozens of monitors. The plus-size Maid finally appeared on one screen. She had left before dawn. Alone. She carried only a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. No handbag. No luggage. No sign of running away. She walked calmly through the front gate before disappearing beyond the camera's range. The Mafia boss watched the footage twice, then a third time. He paused the video at the exact moment she stepped onto the road. Something caught his attention. White lilies, freshly wrapped. His eyes narrowed. The head gardener quietly spoke from behind him. She buys those every Sunday. The Mafia boss turned. For whom? The old gardener lowered his eyes. For her mother. A long silence followed. Another elderly servant stepped forward. She never told anyone. We only found out because the florist mentioned seeing her every week. The Mafia boss said nothing. He simply replayed the footage again. White lilies. Sunday morning. Before sunrise. Then he remembered something almost insignificant. Last night, one of the security guards had reported seeing muddy tire tracks leading toward the old cemetery on the northern hill. At the time, no one thought they mattered. Now, they mattered more than everything else. He turned toward the chief of security. The cemetery. The man immediately understood. Our team can be there in 15 minutes. The Mafia boss shook his head. No. He opened the driver's door himself. I'm going first. As the engine roared to life, no one inside the estate realized that a quiet maid's unexplained absence had just interrupted a meeting worth billions of dollars. Nor did anyone realize that before the morning ended, one shattered gravestone would ignite a chain of events powerful enough to shake families who had considered themselves untouchable. The cemetery gates stood half open when the Mafia boss arrived. His car rolled to a stop without the roar of a convoy or the presence of armed escorts. For a man whose arrival usually attracted fear, the quiet felt strangely appropriate. He stepped onto the narrow stone path alone, following a trail of flattened grass and fresh footprints that disappeared into the morning mist. Then he heard it. Not crying. Not screaming. The soft scrape of fabric against cracked marble. He continued forward. The plus-size maid was kneeling beside a shattered gravestone, completely unaware that anyone had found her. Her fingers moved frantically across the broken white marble, trying to wipe away thick black paint that had already dried into the stone. Each time she rubbed harder, the words only spread farther. Her hands were stained black. Tiny cuts from the shattered edges of the marble had mixed with the paint until streaks of blood covered her fingertips. She whispered the same sentence over and over. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Not because she believed the hateful words, because she couldn't erase them. The bouquet of white lilies she had carried before dawn lay crushed beneath muddy footprints. Someone had stepped on every flower deliberately before smashing the vase against the gravestone. Large pieces of marble surrounded her knees. The headstone had not cracked by accident. It had been destroyed with repeated blows. The Mafia boss stopped several steps away. He had witnessed executions. He had watched rivals beg for mercy. He had buried loyal men without allowing himself to shed a single tear. Yet nothing in those years unsettled him as much as the woman before him. She wasn't mourning her own humiliation. She was desperately trying to restore the dignity of someone who could no longer defend herself. Only then did he read the sentence written across the broken stone. Even death couldn't hide your fat daughter's shame. His expression did not change. That frightened people far more than anger ever could. The plus-size maid finally sensed another presence behind her. She turned quickly. For a brief second, panic flashed across her face. Then embarrassment replaced it. She hurriedly wiped at her tears before lowering her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have been back before breakfast." Not one word about the destroyed grave, not one complaint, not one request for help. She apologized for being late. The Mafia boss looked from her exhausted face to the shattered monument. Without speaking, he removed his expensive coat and gently placed it around her shoulders. She instinctively tried to return it. "It'll get dirty." He quietly pushed her hands back. "It already has." She frowned in confusion. Only then did she notice her trembling fingers. Black paint, mud, blood. Ashamed, she hid both hands behind her back. He noticed anyway. Slowly, he crouched beside the grave. His fingertips brushed across the fractured marble until they stopped beneath the hateful message. Someone had carefully chosen every word. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message. Someone knew exactly who she was. Someone knew she came here every Sunday. Someone wanted her to discover this with her own eyes. He stood again. Without hesitation, he reached for his phone. The call connected after a single ring. "Boss." His voice remained calm. "I want every vehicle that entered this cemetery during the last 48 hours. "Yes, boss." Every phone signal. "Understood." Every security camera within 5 miles. "We're on it." He ended the call. No threats, no shouting, no promises of revenge. The silence itself carried enough weight. The plus-size maid looked at him uncertainly. "You don't have to do this." He turned toward her. "Who paid for your mother's funeral?" She blinked. "I did." "And the hospital bills?" "I finished paying them last year." "You came here every week?" She nodded. Every Sunday. Rain, snow, heat. She had never missed. The realization settled heavily between them. She had been carrying this grief completely alone while serving everyone else inside his estate. No one had noticed. Not because she hid it perfectly, because no one had ever stopped to ask. A cold wind swept across the hill. She pulled the coat tighter around herself, still staring at the broken gravestone. "My mother always worried people would remember me only for my weight," she said softly. "I promised her I would live with dignity." Her voice trembled. "I couldn't even protect the one place where she rests." For the first time, the Mafia boss looked directly into her eyes. "You didn't fail her." She slowly lifted her head. "The person who did this failed." He looked once more at the shattered stone before speaking with quiet certainty. "This grave will be restored." She tried to protest. "It's too expensive. I wasn't asking." She fell silent. His phone vibrated. A new message appeared. "We found disabled security cameras. Professional work." This was planned. Another message arrived seconds later. One witness remembers a luxury sedan leaving shortly after midnight. The Mafia boss read both messages without changing expression. Professional, organized, premeditated. Someone hadn't simply vandalized a grave. Someone had studied her routine. Someone had waited until she was most vulnerable. Someone wanted to break her spirit without ever laying a hand on her. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then he looked at the plus-size maid. "Go home,"
She hesitated. What about my mother? His eyes rested on the shattered marble for one final moment. Then he answered in the same calm voice that had decided the fate of powerful men for years. Leave this to me. As she slowly walked toward the cemetery gate, another phone began ringing somewhere deep inside the city. Then another, and another. Before the sun fully rose above the skyline, every major intelligence network connected to the Mafia Boss had received exactly the same order. Find the person who touched that grave, before I do.
The plus-size maid returned to the estate just as the kitchen staff finished preparing breakfast. She paused outside the servants' entrance, carefully scrubbing the mud from her shoes with an old brush before stepping inside. She splashed cold water across her face until the redness around her eyes faded enough that no one would immediately ask questions. Then she took a slow breath. By the time she entered the kitchen, the familiar smile had returned. Small, gentle, convincing enough. The elderly cook looked up from the stove. There you are. She bowed her head slightly. I'm sorry for being late. He frowned. You've never apologized for being late before. She forced another smile. I'll make up the work. Without waiting for another word, she tied on her apron and quietly began arranging breakfast trays, as though nothing unusual had happened. No complaint. No explanation. No mention of the cemetery. The older servants exchanged uneasy glances. Something about her smile felt different. It was the same smile she wore every day. Only now, it seemed heavier. From the second-floor office, the Mafia Boss stood beside the floor-to-ceiling window, overlooking the courtyard. Below, the plus-size maid was hanging freshly washed linens beneath the morning sun. The sleeves of her uniform hid most of the scratches on her arms. Most. Not all. Every now and then, she paused to flex her fingers before continuing, the tiny cuts from the broken marble clearly causing her pain. Yet she never slowed down. She carried another basket, helped an elderly gardener lift heavy flower pots, stopped to feed one of the estate's stray cats, then disappeared toward the greenhouse, as though the cemetery had never happened. His trusted advisor quietly entered the office. You asked for everything we could find. A thin folder landed on the desk. There isn't much. The Mafia Boss opened it. The first page contained her employment record. 3 years. Perfect attendance. Never disciplined. Never involved in conflict. Every evaluation described her with nearly identical words. Quiet. Reliable. Respectful. Invisible. He turned another page. There was almost nothing about her personal life. No father. No husband. No children. No siblings listed. Only one emergency contact. Mother. He continued reading. His eyes stopped on the final medical report. Deceased. Almost 2 years earlier. Cancer. Treatment. Discontinued after the family exhausted every available dollar. Another document followed. Hospital payment records. The account had remained active for 18 months after her mother's death. Monthly installments. Always on time. Never missed. His brows drew together. She kept paying? The advisor nodded. The hospital allowed delayed payments. She refused financial assistance. Silence settled across the office. Another envelope appeared. Inside were dozens of security photographs collected from traffic cameras across the city. Every Sunday, almost the exact same time, the same bus stop, the same florist, the same bouquet of inexpensive white lilies wrapped in brown paper, the same walk toward the cemetery. Rain, snow, summer heat. She never missed. Not once. The Mafia Boss slowly placed the photographs side by side. You knew about this. The advisor shook his head. No. The florist recognized her after our people started asking questions. What did he say? He said she always bought the smallest bouquet. A brief pause. Then, she apologized because she couldn't afford anything nicer. The room became completely still. The advisor continued quietly. But before leaving, she always asked him to make the flowers look beautiful anyway. The mafia boss looked back toward the courtyard. The woman everyone overlooked. The woman who quietly repaired broken furniture before anyone noticed. Who remembered every employee's birthday? Who secretly left homemade soup outside a guard's room whenever he became ill? Who spent years paying debts for someone who was already gone? Had never once asked anyone for help. Not because she was proud, because she didn't want to become someone else's burden. He closed the folder. What about the cemetery? The advisor's expression immediately hardened. Our investigators found something unusual. He handed over another report. The security cameras weren't vandalized. They were professionally disabled. Another page. The caretaker says the damage happened shortly after midnight. Witnesses? None. Cameras from nearby roads captured one black luxury sedan leaving the area. License plate? Fake. Professional. Planned. Carefully executed. This had never been random cruelty. Someone had chosen that grave. Someone had known exactly when she would arrive. Someone had wanted to break her without ever touching her. His phone vibrated. A secure message flashed across the screen. We traced the sedan to a private warehouse before it disappeared. Another message followed almost instantly. Boss, you're going to want to see who rented that warehouse. He opened the attached file. A single name appeared. One he recognized immediately. Not because she belonged to the underworld, because she had tried to enter his world only months earlier. A powerful businesswoman, owner of one of the city's largest construction groups. Publicly admired, privately feared. 3 months ago, she had personally visited the estate while he was overseas, hoping to secure an exclusive redevelopment contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The proposal had never reached his desk. It had been rejected at the front gate. His eyes narrowed. Who refused her? The advisor looked up. The plus-size Maid. For the first time that morning, the mafia boss stopped turning pages. My maid. The advisor nodded. According to every witness, the businesswoman arrived with expensive gifts for the household staff. Wine, jewelry, an envelope filled with cash. The mafia boss already knew the rules. No employee accepted gifts. No exceptions. What happened? The advisor slid forward another statement. The plus-size Maid politely returned everything. No argument. No raised voice. She only said one sentence. The mafia boss read it himself. The rules of this house are not for sale. Nothing more. She had simply closed the gate. The advisor exhaled slowly. The businesswoman left immediately. But, according to several employees, she looked humiliated. The room fell silent. Everything suddenly aligned. The destroyed grave. The hateful message. The disabled cameras. This had never been about the cemetery. It had started months earlier. The plus-size Maid had unknowingly embarrassed someone who had spent her entire life believing money could buy anything. She couldn't challenge the mafia boss directly. So she chose the one person she believed had no one to protect her. The mafia boss slowly stood and buttoned his jacket. His advisors watched without speaking. Whenever he became this quiet, they knew someone else's future had already changed. He picked up his phone. Bring me everything. The company's finances, the board members, the investors, the political connections. The advisor hesitated. Should we prepare an arrest? The mafia boss walked toward the door. People instinctively stepped aside. His answer came without the slightest trace of emotion. No. He stopped with one hand resting on the door handle. People like her don't fear prison. He looked back once. They fear losing everything they built. While the entire world is watching. The office remained silent long after he had left. Every person inside understood the same thing. The investigation had ended. Now, the reckoning was about to begin. The city never noticed the first move. There were no armed convoys, no police raids, no headlines about gang wars, no dramatic declarations. That was exactly how the mafia boss preferred to destroy someone. Quietly. Patiently. So quietly that by the time the victim realized what was happening, there was nothing left to save. 3 days after the cemetery incident, the businesswoman arrived at the headquarters of her construction empire, expecting another ordinary Monday. Her assistant met her before she reached the elevator. "You have a problem." She barely looked up. "Handle it. The 9 o'clock meeting has been cancelled." She continued walking. "Reschedule. They've already signed with another developer." Her footsteps slowed. "Who?" They refused to say. She frowned but kept moving. One client was disappointing. Nothing more. Until her phone rang. Another cancellation. Then another. Within 30 minutes, 3 long-term investors had withdrawn from projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every explanation sounded almost identical. "We've decided to pursue another opportunity. The timing is no longer suitable. We're moving in a different direction. No accusations. No negotiations. No room for discussion. Just closed doors." Inside the mafia boss's estate, life appeared completely normal. The plus-size maid quietly polished the grand piano in the music room before carrying fresh flowers to the library. She greeted every servant with the same gentle smile. She thanked the gardeners for helping the roses survive the summer heat. She even stopped to prepare warm tea for the elderly gatekeeper whose cough had returned overnight. Nothing about her behavior suggested she knew a silent war had already begun because of her. The mafia boss intended to keep it that way. She had spent years carrying burdens that never belonged to anyone else. He refused to let revenge become another one. Late that afternoon, his chief intelligence officer entered the private study, carrying a thick black folder. "The first phase is complete." The mafia boss looked up. "Report. 23 investors have suspended cooperation. 7 banks have requested additional financial reviews. 2 insurance companies have delayed renewals. 4 suppliers now require advance payment." He nodded once. "No pressure?" "None." "No threats?" "None." The intelligence chief allowed himself the faintest smile. They all made their own decisions. That was the terrifying part. The mafia boss rarely forced anyone. He simply made it painfully expensive to stand on the wrong side of him. Every executive in the city understood one simple truth. Doing business with him opened doors. Choosing his enemy quietly closed them. No warnings were necessary. His phone vibrated. A secure message appeared. 3 board members resigned this afternoon. Seconds later, another arrived. Her company's stock has begun falling. He locked the screen without changing expression. "This isn't enough." The intelligence chief looked surprised. "It isn't?" "No." He walked toward the window, overlooking the gardens. "She's still protecting her reputation. And when that disappears," he answered without turning around, "everything else will collapse by itself." Across town, panic was beginning to spread. The businesswoman stood before a massive digital display inside her executive boardroom. Every chart pointed downward. Revenue projections, investor confidence, construction schedules. Nothing made sense. Her legal director entered carrying another folder. "We've lost the Riverside redevelopment project." She stared. "Impossible. They terminated the agreement this morning." "Our lawyers?" "They can't find any breach of contract." Another executive hurried inside. "The harbor expansion has also been suspended. And the East District? They've frozen funding. For the first time in years." Silence replaced confidence. Someone wasn't attacking her company. Someone was convincing the entire city to abandon it, piece by piece, without leaving fingerprints. She slammed both hands against the conference table. Who is doing this? No one answered, because no one knew. That evening, the Mafia Boss attended a private dinner attended by some of the most influential business leaders in the country. There were no contracts on the table, no negotiations, only food, wine, quiet conversation. The businesswoman's name was never mentioned. It didn't need to be. Every guest had already heard enough. One elderly chairman finally broke the silence. If she asks why everyone is leaving, what should we tell her? The Mafia Boss calmly folded his napkin. If she understands respect, she'll already know. He stood. The dinner ended immediately. No speeches, no farewell. Every executive quietly watched him leave. Each understood the same message. The decision had already been made. No one wanted to become the next person standing alone. Meanwhile, back at the estate, the plus-size maid struggled to carry several heavy boxes, filled with blankets destined for a nearby orphanage. She nearly lost her balance as she crossed the entrance hall. Before the boxes slipped from her hands, someone reached forward and lifted the entire stack effortlessly. She looked up. The Mafia Boss. "You don't have to carry these," she said softly. "I know." He continued walking. She hurried beside him. After a long silence, she spoke again. "The cemetery caretaker called this morning." He glanced toward her. "They repaired my mother's gravestone." A small smile appeared on her face. The flowers were replaced too. She lowered her eyes. "They said someone donated enough money to restore the entire cemetery." Her voice became quieter. "I wish I knew who did something so kind." The Mafia Boss placed the boxes gently inside the storage room. He said nothing. Instead, his eyes drifted toward her hands. The cuts had begun to heal. Thin white scars now crossed several fingers. He remembered seeing those same hands, desperately trying to erase black paint from broken marble. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Some injuries healed. Some never truly disappeared. Justice wasn't about replacing a gravestone. It was about ensuring the person responsible could never destroy another innocent life again. Across the city, the businesswoman finally received the first report that truly frightened her. Her personal assistant entered the office carrying a sealed envelope. "I think we've identified the problem." She opened it immediately. Inside was a list of every investor, supplier, and executive who had quietly withdrawn from her empire during the previous 72 hours. At first glance, nothing connected them. Then she noticed one familiar name appearing beside nearly every decision. Not as an owner, not as a shareholder, not even as a business partner, simply as the one man none of them could afford to disappoint. Her face slowly lost its color. The Mafia Boss. Before she could finish reading, another envelope arrived. An elegant invitation embossed with gold lettering. The City Heritage Charity Gala. The most influential families in the state would attend. Political leaders, media owners, corporate executives, and the Mafia Boss. She stared at the invitation for several long seconds. Then, very slowly, she smiled. If he's trying to destroy me in silence, she placed the invitation carefully onto her desk. I'll make certain the entire city watches her fall before he has the chance. She looked toward her assistant. Prepare tonight's speech. What would you like to say? The businesswoman's smile became colder than ever. Something that neither of them will ever forget. Far across the city, the Mafia Boss's phone vibrated with a new security alert. She has accepted the invitation to the charity gala. He read the message once, then calmly slipped the phone back into his pocket. For the first time since the cemetery, a faint smile crossed his face. Exactly as planned. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers,
as the city's most powerful families gathered for the annual Heritage Charity Gala. Television cameras lined the entrance. Reporters welcomed politicians, philanthropists, and billionaires with practiced smiles. Champagne flowed freely. Conversations revolved around generosity, community, and honor. It was the perfect stage for people who cared deeply about appearances. The plus-size maid wanted nothing to do with it. She had only agreed to help because the estate was one of the event's principal sponsors, and several members of the household staff were assigned to assist with the evening service. She wore the same neatly pressed black uniform she always wore. Her hair was tied back, no jewelry, no makeup beyond what was necessary to appear professional. Exactly as she preferred. Invisible. She moved quietly between tables, refilling water glasses before guests even realized they were empty. Every task was performed with the same quiet precision that had defined the last 3 years of her life. Most people never noticed her. One person did. Across the ballroom, the businesswoman watched every movement with a satisfied smile. So she came. Her assistant leaned closer. Should we simply ignore her? The businesswoman slowly shook her head. No. She lifted her champagne glass without taking a sip. Tonight, she'll become the center of attention. Near the front of the ballroom, the Mafia Boss sat beside several influential business leaders. He listened politely as the evening's host praised charitable donations and announced record-breaking fundraising totals. To everyone else, he appeared completely relaxed. Only his chief advisor noticed something different. His eyes never wandered. Not once. They remained fixed on the young maid, quietly serving guests near the back of the room, as if he already knew something was coming. The charity auction progressed without incident. Rare paintings sold for astonishing prices. Historic jewelry attracted fierce bidding. The audience applauded each generous donation. Everything unfolded exactly as planned, until the host returned to the stage. Our final guest speaker has devoted years to supporting cultural preservation and community development. Polite applause echoed throughout the ballroom. The businesswoman accepted the microphone with effortless confidence. She thanked the organizers, praised generosity, spoke warmly about compassion. Every sentence sounded carefully rehearsed. Then her gaze drifted toward the back of the ballroom, toward the plus-size maid. A faint smile appeared. I've always believed that true character is revealed by the way we honor those who came before us. Several guests nodded in agreement. It sounded like another inspirational speech. Then her tone changed. Unfortunately, not everyone has that privilege. The ballroom grew quieter. The plus-size maid froze beside a serving cart. I recently learned about a woman whose mother's grave became rather unfortunate. Confused whispers spread through the audience. The businesswoman sighed dramatically. What a heartbreaking story. A broken family, a forgotten future, and finally, a broken grave. Every word landed with deliberate precision. The plus-size maid slowly lifted her head. The businesswoman was looking directly at her. I suppose that happens when even the dead become ashamed of the family they leave behind. Silence. No one moved. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others instinctively followed the speaker's gaze until every eye in the ballroom rested upon the quiet maid. The businesswoman took another measured step across the stage. After all, a maid with no dignity shouldn't expect dignity for her family either. The words struck harder than a slap. The plus-size maid's breathing became shallow. Her fingers tightened around the silver tray she was carrying. She tried to steady herself. She had survived cruel remarks before. She had survived laughter. She had survived humiliation. But hearing her mother mocked in front of hundreds of strangers reopened the wound she had barely begun to heal. Her hands trembled. One crystal glass slipped from the tray. It struck the marble floor. The sharp crash echoed through the silent ballroom. Every conversation stopped. Embarrassed, she immediately knelt to collect the shattered pieces. "I'm sorry." The apology escaped automatically. "I'm so sorry." The same words she had whispered at the cemetery. The same words she had repeated her entire life whenever someone else's cruelty somehow became her responsibility. Before she could reach the largest shard, another hand calmly lifted it first. Large, steady, unhurried. The ballroom watched in complete silence as the Mafia boss crouched beside her. He carefully placed the sharp piece back onto the tray before gently taking her injured hand into his own. A thin line of blood had appeared across one finger. Without hesitation, he removed a spotless white handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it carefully around the cut. His movements were slow, almost gentle, as though the hundreds of spectators surrounding them no longer existed. Only after making certain she was standing steadily did he quietly ask, "Does it hurt?" She shook her head. "No, sir." He looked directly into her eyes. "For once, stop apologizing for someone else's cruelty." The sentence was soft, barely louder than a whisper. Yet in the absolute silence of the ballroom, everyone heard it. The plus-size maid stared at him in disbelief. No one had ever said those words to her before. Not once. She lowered her head again, unable to speak. The Mafia boss slowly turned toward the stage. His expression revealed nothing. No anger, no shouting, no threat. That frightened the businesswoman more than rage ever could. He walked forward one measured step at a time. The sound of polished leather shoes echoed through the ballroom. Nobody dared block his path. The host instinctively stepped aside. The musicians lowered their instruments. Even the photographers stopped taking pictures. When he reached the stage, he accepted the microphone without asking permission. He didn't look at the businesswoman. He looked toward the technical control booth. "Turn on the main screen." The technicians hesitated. The event director looked nervously toward the organizers. No one spoke. Finally, one technician pressed the command. The giant LED screen behind the stage flickered to life. At first, only darkness appeared. Then, a surveillance timestamp. Then another. Finally, a clear high-definition video filled the screen. The businesswoman's confident smile disappeared instantly. She recognized the footage before anyone else in the room. It showed a luxury sedan arriving outside the cemetery shortly after midnight. The driver's door opened. She stepped out. Moments later, two hired men emerged carrying crowbars, black paint, and heavy tools. The ballroom fell into complete silence. The video continued. One man smashed the gravestone again and again. Another sprayed black paint across the marble. Then, under the headlights of the luxury sedan, the businesswoman calmly walked forward and personally wrote the final hateful sentence across the grave before smiling for the men to leave. No one in the ballroom breathed. The cameras that had come to celebrate charity were now broadcasting something entirely different, and the Mafia boss still hadn't spoken a single word.
No one applauded. No one whispered. Hundreds of people simply stared at the enormous screen as the final seconds of the surveillance footage came to an end. The ballroom that had been filled with laughter only minutes earlier now felt unbearably silent. The businesswoman stood frozen at the center of the stage. Every carefully rehearsed word she had spoken about dignity and compassion had collapsed in front of the entire city. She opened her mouth to explain. That video. The Mafia boss calmly raised one hand. She stopped speaking immediately, not because he shouted, because everyone in the room instinctively understood that interrupting him would only make the humiliation worse. He slowly turned toward the audience. "There are people in this city," he said evenly, "who donate millions of dollars so cameras will remember their names." His voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom. "And there are people who quietly spend years sacrificing everything they have for someone they love, without expecting anyone to notice." His eyes moved toward the plus-size Maid. She stood near the back of the room, still holding the silver tray, completely overwhelmed by what was happening. He continued, "Tonight, I think everyone has finally discovered which kind of person deserves respect." Silence. Then one elderly woman slowly began to clap. She had lost her husband years earlier and had spent decades supporting charities for grieving families. She understood exactly what had happened. Another guest joined her, then another. Within seconds, the applause spread across the entire ballroom. Not for the Mafia Boss, not for the charity gala, for the quiet young maid who had spent years believing she was invisible. Many guests stood. Several wiped tears from their eyes. Others lowered their heads in shame, remembering how they had ignored her while praising people with wealth and influence. The plus-size Maid looked around in disbelief. She had spent her entire life trying not to be noticed. Now, for the first time, she was being seen for who she truly was. The businesswoman desperately tried to regain control. "You can't ruin everything I've built over one misunderstanding." The Mafia Boss finally looked at her. "A misunderstanding." He nodded toward the giant screen. "You hired men. You destroyed a grave. You mocked a woman who could no longer defend herself." His expression remained calm. Nothing about that was misunderstood. Security officers quietly approached the stage. Not his men. City investigators. The evidence had already been delivered before the gala began. The lead investigator presented an arrest warrant. "You are being charged with conspiracy, destruction of protected property, witness intimidation, and multiple counts of organized harassment." The businesswoman looked around the ballroom. No one stepped forward. Not one investor. Not one politician. Not one executive. The same people who had once competed for her attention now avoided meeting her eyes. She finally understood. She had lost everything before walking into the ballroom. She simply hadn't known it yet. As investigators escorted her away, the cameras continued recording. Not a single person objected. The doors closed behind her. She never returned to the city's social circles again. Within 6 months, her construction company declared bankruptcy. Her board resigned. Her charitable foundation dissolved. Every award bearing her name quietly disappeared from public buildings. People eventually forgot how wealthy she had once been, but they never forgot why she had fallen. Life inside the estate gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. The plus-size Maid once again woke before sunrise. She still greeted every servant with the same gentle smile. She still prepared flowers for every room. She still thanked people before they thanked her. Yet something had changed. People no longer walked past her without noticing. The gardeners saved her a chair during lunch. The kitchen staff insisted she eat before returning to work. The guards no longer accepted homemade soup without inviting her to sit and share a conversation. Respect had quietly replaced pity, not because she had changed, because everyone else finally had. Several weeks later, the Mafia Boss asked her to accompany him somewhere. He never explained where they were going. The drive ended at the cemetery. She stepped out of the car and stopped. The neglected cemetery she remembered had completely transformed. Fresh pathways wound through carefully maintained gardens. New benches rested beneath flowering trees. Children quietly placed flowers beside family memorials. The broken fences had been replaced. The abandoned grounds had become a peaceful memorial park. She slowly walked toward her mother's grave. Her breath caught. The shattered headstone was gone. In its place stood a beautiful monument carved from pristine white marble. Her mother's name had been engraved once more, with quiet elegance. Below it, a simple inscription read, "Forever loved, forever remembered." There were no cruel words, no black paint, no broken stone, only peace. She knelt slowly, placing the familiar bouquet of inexpensive white lilies at the foot of the grave. The same flowers she had brought every Sunday. Only this time, she didn't have to apologize. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the hill. The Mafia Boss stepped beside her. Without bodyguards, without assistants, without the authority that usually surrounded him. He placed another bouquet beside hers. Then he spoke softly. "I couldn't give your mother more time." He paused. "But no one will ever dishonor her again." Tears rolled silently down the plus-size maid's face. Not tears of grief, tears of relief. She whispered toward the gravestone. "I kept my promise, Mom. I came back. And..." A genuine smile finally appeared. "I'm not alone anymore." The Mafia Boss waited until she stood. As they slowly walked back toward the car, she finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had remained in her heart. "Why did you do all of this, for me?" He looked across the peaceful cemetery before answering. When someone loses the last person they love, their greatest fear isn't loneliness. He met her eyes. It's that one day the world will forget that person ever existed. He looked back toward the restored gravestone. "No one deserves to carry that fear alone." She said nothing. She simply walked beside him. For the first time since entering the estate 3 years earlier, she no longer lowered her head while walking. She looked forward, toward a future she had never believed she deserved. Months later, the memorial garden, established in her mother's honor, had expanded into a charitable foundation that restored neglected graves for families who could not afford proper memorials. No names were carved onto the donation plaques. No photographs celebrated the people who funded it. That was exactly how the Mafia Boss wanted it. The plus-size maid volunteered there every Sunday. She quietly arranged flowers for strangers, just as she had once arranged them for her own mother. Children laughed among the gardens. Families found comfort where sorrow had once lived. One act of cruelty had unexpectedly created a place where thousands of people could remember those they loved with dignity. As the sun slowly set behind the restored cemetery, the Mafia Boss and the plus-size maid stood together in peaceful silence. Neither of them spoke. Words were no longer necessary. Some victories were never meant to be celebrated with revenge. Some were measured by the number of lives that became brighter, because compassion had refused to surrender. And long after people forgot the empire he built, they would remember the day the most feared Mafia Boss in the city chose to protect the dignity of one quiet plus-size maid, and, in doing so, reminded an entire city that true strength is not measured by power, but by the kindness used to defend those who cannot defend themselves.